it was essentially expanding what Lenin tried to do with the commanding heights of industry during the NEP. And how it would work is they would introduce these 5-year plans. The first 5-year plan is introduced in 1928. And how this would work is that the State Planning Committee, Gosplan, would set targets for each industry to start producing certain amounts of stuff. So coal industry, we expect you to produce this much coal. Steel industry, which we expect you to within 5 years, right? And giving you sort of yearly points of reference. This would then be passed down to the ministries. So the ministries now control these different sectors, and they're mostly focused on heavy industries. So you have the ministry for coal, you have the ministry for steel. I believe the post-war Labour government had similar structures in place. So what they then have to do is they take these plans and they pass it down to the sub-departments of their ministries, who then draw up plans for the enterprises, these factories. And they are then told to produce this much or this much within a given year. And then the enterprise has to actually enforce this. So that's how a command economy works, which is very different to how we think of as a free market economy. Because in a free market economy, as we know, things are allocated by the free exchange between, buyers and sellers, between, everything is determined by supply and demand. Resources are allocated, prices are set because of supply and demand forces. Whereas in a command economy, where resources go, what the prices are, how much is to be produced is set by a central planner.
So all of that is set essentially by Gosplan in negotiation with the various ministries, and then it sort of cascades down. How well does this work in practice?
Not very well. And so there is the way to kind of break this down is to sort of think about why this doesn't work from a sort of economic theoretical perspective. It's a very Austrian school thing to do. Not to say that I fully subscribe to the Austrian school, but I find it actually just the best way, because you can soon find out it's very nonsensical. And so the three main problems with a command economy is, one, the issue of information's asymmetries, or it was also called the problem of economic calculation. Two, something called soft budget constraints, which was produced by a Hungarian economist called János Kornai in the 1980s. And then the third problem is a principal agent problem, which any students have studied economics has probably stumbled across that one already. So the first problem, which is the problem of information asymmetries. So it's quite complicated to get your head around, but in a capitalist economy, like I said, things get allocated because of supply and demand forces, right? I produce something because I believe people want it.
And they're willing to pay for it.
And it's mediated by the scarcity of what I can produce, right? But, so what I'm doing is I'm responding to the information that I'm receiving from demand in the economy, right? So information is freely flowing towards me. However, within the command economy, they're not only not able to listen to this, so I'll get onto why they can't understand the information even from its purest perspective, but they don't care about this info. They don't care about demand.
Yeah.
Because what does Stalin want? He wants industrialization. He wants big factories. And I think that's because of two reasons. One, because militarization. The fear of the war with the imperialists who, the capitalist powers, in his view, that is coming. So we have to actually arm ourselves. And two, because there is this really strange Marxist, I like to use funny terms, but Marxist fetishization of industry, right? Because Marx writes in the 19th century in Britain and Germany, he thinks that manufacturing is what economic progress looks like, which of course is very different to what it will eventually look like, which is, technology sectors and service sectors. So maybe Stalin and Trump will share something there in their love for big pounding machines. But so what the command economy is geared towards is not responding to market demand, this information that's coming from people, or even the suppliers. They're focused on something called the priority principle. And the priority principle is when you say that we're going to prioritize the production of heavy industrial goods. And so what are you not producing a lot of? Consumer goods, right? Goods that people use, right? I do not buy sheets of steel off a catalogue. Unfortunately, I'm not a welder.
Yeah.
But I do buy lamps and hex bugs. Yeah. There was a fun little tech thing for children back in the day.
Yeah.
Right. So that is something I would buy, but I don't buy heavy sheets of steel. So what's being produced is not really what people want. And it's worsened by what's known as the material balance system, which is that if there's any shortfall in what needs to be produced in the priority sectors like steel and coal, then you'd have to take resources away from the lower priority industries like clothes, textiles, and redistribute them back to the heavy industries that have priority. So you're creating this economy that essentially is not responding to what people want, to the information within the economy, and is essentially producing steel that is just had the value of being steel and producing even more factories and even more industrial goods.
Because there is this target being handed down from
Gosplan
and ultimately Stalin. Yeah. I like steel. I want more steel.
He's literally the man of steel.
Well, yeah.
But there's a very interesting debate that comes about amongst economists in the 1920s and 30s called the debate over economic calculation, which has the longest word in German. It was one of those horrible compound words that I couldn't say. I think your colleague Christian.
Well, we'll need to get Christian
to help us with that one.
He can dub it in.
Yeah. But what they say is, okay, maybe if you get rid of this priority principle, a command economy might actually be able to simulate a capitalist economy while getting rid of all these sort of, all the classic problems that happens with markets, which is, huge booms and busts, oversupply, which, in my view, is actually always caused by some form of terrible government intervention. But that's a much more nuanced point that has to be discussed elsewhere. So you have two main economists who argue this. One is Oscar Lange and the other is Abba Lerner. And Lerner specifically says, you can simulate this market economy because you can set all these targets, and then if something is clearly oversupplied or something's clearly overdemanded, you just make a quick shift.
Yeah.
Right? And he even argued, which sort of mirrors kind of musings today in the policy sector world, that you can introduce other costs that a market wouldn't consider, like
social costs,
pollution, the classic idea of exogeneity, negative exogenous factors, externalities. That's it. So he believes you can do this. Well, wow, we found this system, but the people the economists who suggest that this doesn't function, and which has been proven time and time again, not only by the command economy systems, but also by trying to introduce social costs into a market, like carbon taxes, for example, is that the information required to actually respond to supply and demand cannot be centralized. There's too much of it, right? It inherently has to be decentralized, right? This was made by Ludwig von Mises and, of course, Friedrich Hayek, right? Which I believe this institution is very fond of.
Yes.
So Hayek says in the seminal essay in 1945 that ultimately, because information is dispersed and distributed within society, that no one man can actually understand it all. For example, so let's say I'm a small business owner, I own a café in Newcastle. I don't know why I chose Newcastle, but hey, I love the city. And I figure out that people in my local area, the information I'm receiving is that they really like Dubai chocolate, which is now very big, right? So I say to myself, well, I'm going to start making Dubai chocolate, right? But how does a commissioner in London know that people in Newcastle might be wanting Dubai chocolate? Because actually people in Birmingham might be wanting, poppyseed muffins.
Yeah.
Right? So that information is very localized and dispersed. So that's why they suggest that ultimately only a market economy can allow for perfect information symmetry, because it actually allows supply and demand forces to be responded to in a much more localized level.
And you have real prices that
which acts as signals of what is popular and what isn't.
Yeah.
Right? Or
rather than
scarcity or not.
We even under Stalin, we have a price system, but the prices are also being set by a committee, so they're not
real prices. They don't actually reflect the real value. And I trace this back to a very specific problem of Marxism, which comes from Marx himself. And this is a very nuanced point that many critics of Marx, I think, fail to make in their adjuncts to socialists and Marxists, which is that Marx has a very outdated theory of economics, namely his use of the labor theory of value, which was actually developed by Ricardo. People would consider, Ricardian theory and sort of comparative advantage is an inherently free market idea. But he believes that the value of things like this Diet Coke, which, as you can tell, I've been scoffing down, or this glass, is based on the amount of labor that went into the product, right?
So 10 hours of labor went into the Diet Coke, or 10 minutes of labor, it's worth
10x. Yeah, x being the value of your labor.
Yeah,
which who knows how that's determined? That's sort of links back to land value, but it's very complicated, right?
Yeah,
it's the food that and the clothes that you need to simply exist.
Yeah,
that's how Marx would conceive as that value. So let's say it takes £10 for me. £10. All right, living in London, it takes me £50 to live a day.
Yeah,
or maybe that's even too high. To live a day in London. So therefore, this is worth. If I worked 8 hours on this, it would be worth 8 times 5, which is £400. So just making sure I can remember my maths.
Yeah.
So
8 times 50, presumably.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So this is the thing about economists. Calculators do most of our work now. But the problem with the labor. So he views this labor theory of value as okay. Well, what's capitalism's role in this? Well, what it is this is worth, let's say, £400. And I, as the capitalist, the evil capitalist, with big moustache and monocle, I'm going to pay you the worker £350 and pocket £50 for myself as profit. So it's exploitation. That's what he means by the exploitation of capitalists. Because actually, you produced all this and the capitalist hasn't given anything. He's just there to steal it. But what is missed from the labor theory of value is, of course, the huge contribution that capital does make to economic growth, namely the complex machinery that I had to purchase in order to create this item, but also the entrepreneurial risk I've taken to start this business. So that is inherently present within the value of something. But the key problem, which was already being addressed at the time of Marx's writings by economists like William Stanley Jevons and Alfred Marshall, is that this is a very supply-side view of how something is produced. You also have to understand that things have to respond to demand. Things actually need to be wanted. Right, that sort of information problem. And because Marx doesn't account for this, that the fact that actually something, I could produce this for £400, but if no one's in the market for cups, it has no value.
Yeah.
Right? So that's sort of the problem that the command economy has, right? And the socialists have their view, the Soviets have, but also socialists. They think of products as purely a product of labor, but actually it's a product of labor and capital, but also how much demand is going into that product. So, but there's a big contradiction. Marx says capital is exploitation, but capital is fundamental to economic development and innovation. So he recognizes that point because he says that capitalism is required to create socialism, the material abundance. So he recognizes capital's crucial role, but simultaneously saying it's inherently just exploitative and has no real value. So that's huge contradiction is passed to the Soviets. So that when they're producing this command economy, right, they're heavily focused on producing higher output to create material abundance. But actually, when we looked at the archives after the collapse of the Soviet Union, at Stalin's archives, we find that he's not focused too much on output. He's focused on the investment level, the capital accumulation level. Which is hilarious, right? It sounds like a capitalist, right?
Yeah. Well, you make exactly this point in your article. You say Stalin is a capitalist.